Good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you for asking. So, let's get started. Today we're going to be discussing the history of the United States. Are you familiar with the subject?
Yes, I am. We briefly went over it last year, but I'm looking forward to learning more about it.
Great! I'm glad to hear that. So, let's start with the American Revolution. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. The American Revolution was a war fought between the 13 British colonies in North America and Great Britain. It lasted from 1775 to 1783 and resulted in the colonies gaining independence from Britain.
Very good. And what was the main reason why the colonies wanted to gain independence?
The main reason was because they felt that Britain was taxing them unfairly without giving them any representation in Parliament. The famous slogan was "No taxation without representation."
Excellent. You really know your stuff. Now, let's move on to the Civil War. Can you give me a brief overview of what happened during that time period?
The Civil War was fought between the northern and southern states of the United States from 1861 to 1865. The main cause of the war was the issue of slavery, which was legal in the South but banned in the North. The war resulted in the abolition of slavery and the reunification of the country.
Very good. Now, let's move on to a more recent event. What can you tell me about the Civil Rights Movement?
The Civil Rights Movement was a social movement in the United States that aimed to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. It took place in the 1950s and 1960s and was led by prominent figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks.
Excellent. You really have a good grasp on American history. Do you have any questions about what we've covered so far?
Actually, I do. I was wondering if you could explain to me more about the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The Cold War was a geopolitical conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from 1947 to 1991. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major event during the Cold War in which the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which was very close to the United States. The United States responded by imposing a naval blockade around Cuba, and the two countries came very close to nuclear war.
Wow, that's really intense. I never realized how close we came to nuclear war during that time period.
Yes, it was a very tense time in American history. But it's important to learn about these events so that we can understand the past and use that knowledge to shape a better future.
I completely agree. Thank you for explaining that to me.
Of course, anytime. Do you have any other questions about American history or anything else we've covered in class?
Actually, I was wondering if you had any tips for studying for the upcoming exam.
Absolutely. My first piece of advice would be to review your notes and textbook regularly. It's important to stay on top of the material so that you don't fall behind. Secondly, try to participate in class as much as possible. The more engaged you are in the subject matter, the more likely you are to remember it. Finally, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Thank you, sir.